She'd pictured this day so many times that when it finally came, it felt almost unreal. The early June sun baking the rows of folding chairs, the smell of cut grass drifting on the breeze, the chatter of families packed into the bleachers with flowers and cameras and cheap noisemakers. For once, she felt light. No more nights spent hunched over textbooks in a library that never seemed warm enough. No more panic attacks over missed rent when tuition checks were late. She was here. She'd made it. She spotted her mother first in the sea of faces, sitting up front in a modest navy dress, a bouquet of daisies in her lap. They'd picked those flowers together every spring when she was a kid. Her mom caught her eye, smiled, and tapped a hand over her heart like she'd done on every school stage since kindergarten. And then she saw him. Her dad. She'd told herself he might not come. He'd missed her high school graduation, claiming work, and her mother had covered for him even then. But there he was near the edge of the row, sunglasses pushed up in his hair, grinning like the proud father she'd wished he would be. For a second, that old ache flickered. Maybe this would be different. Maybe he'd finally show up for her the way he'd promised he would. But then she saw the woman next to him, tall, dark hair curled to perfection, a bright silk scarf draped around her neck like she was about to star in a perfume ad. Her hand rested on his knee, her manicured fingers tapping out some private joke. She leaned in, whispering something that made him laugh. When the woman looked up, she locked eyes with his daughter, and the way she smirked, all casual cruelty, made the hair stand up on the back of her neck. Her stomach turned. She forced herself to focus on the name being read on stage ahead of her. But the heat of that sight wouldn't fade. He'd brought her here. To this. To the one day that was supposed to be hers alone, no strings, no betrayals, no awkward silences at the family dinner table. Her mother sat just a few rows away. Did she know? Had he warned her? Or did she have to look up and see the woman who'd cracked her marriage wide open, perched next to the man she'd once trusted with her whole life? She walked across the stage when her name was called, her gown rustling around her ankles, the degree folder slick and cold in her damp palms. She heard her mother's voice, the one she'd waited for, loud and bright over the scattered applause. "That's my girl." She didn't hear her father's voice. Just the muted sound of his clapping, the click of his mistress's acrylic nails tapping together like the slow tick of a bomb. When she stepped down and found her mother in the crush of bodies afterward, they hugged so tightly she thought her ribs would snap. Her mom's voice was trembling. "You did it, baby. You did it all by yourself." But over her shoulder, she could see her father making his way through the crowd, the mistress at his side, bright red lipstick untouched by the cheap plastic cup of punch she swirled around in her hand. He had the nerve to smile when he reached them. "Hey, sweetheart. Look at you, top of the class. We're so proud. Aren't we, honey?" He squeezed the woman's shoulder like she was family, like this was all so normal. Her mother went stiff beside her. She pulled back, the hope that had warmed her just minutes ago draining like sand through a sieve. She looked him dead in the eye, the same eyes she'd inherited, the ones she'd looked for in the mirror all those nights she'd wondered why she was never enough for him to just show up. "You didn't have to come," she said, her voice calm. "Not like this." He scoffed, waving it off. "Don't be dramatic. She's part of my life now, you'll get used to it. It's your big day. Smile for the camera." The mistress's grin was sharper than any diploma. In that instant, she felt something settle in her chest, not the old ache, not the old begging to be seen, but a cold clarity. If he wanted to show up with his mess, she'd show him how it felt to pay for what he broke. And this time, the bill wouldn't be hers. She didn't even make it to the little reception the university set up behind the auditorium, the one with the folding tables covered in store-bought cookies and lukewarm lemonade. She could hear her mom's old friends calling her name, asking for photos, wanting to brag about the girl who'd done so well. But their voices sounded muffled, like she was listening through a wall of static. Her dad followed her across the lawn, the mistress tottering behind him on heels that sank into the soft grass. She heard the sharp click of them, the way they stuck for half a second before popping free. Funny how that sound felt louder than her own heartbeat. "Hey," he called, his voice that same forced cheer he'd used when he forgot her birthdays, when he'd tried to make up for absence with cheap gifts and big grins that never reached his eyes. Wait up, will you? Don't just walk away." She stopped at the edge of the parking lot, turned so fast he nearly stumbled into her. She could see the flecks of gray in his hair now, the lines around his mouth deeper than the last time they'd stood this close. It didn't make him look wiser. Just smaller somehow. "Why?" she asked, her voice flat. Why would you bring her here? This was supposed to be my day." He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Sweetheart, don't be like that. She wanted to be here to support you. She's family now. I thought maybe it was time." She cut him off with a sharp laugh. Family? She's not family. She's the reason Mom can't even stand to say your name anymore. You could have come alone. You could have been here for me." The mistress, she never even liked saying her name in her head, made a tiny noise of protest. "I didn't mean any harm. I thought it would be a nice surprise. I've always wanted to see you graduate." She turned her eyes on her, so cold the woman actually took a step back. Save it. You've had years to stay out of my life. You don't get to play proud step anything now. Her dad's face hardened then, the fake warmth slipping away. You're being ungrateful. Do you know how many kids wish their parents showed up at all? I came, didn't I? I sat there. I clapped. Why do you always have to find something to complain about? That old guilt, the one he'd always used like a leash, tried to stir in her gut. But she shut it down before it could settle. She thought about the scholarships that didn't cover everything. The months she'd eaten stale cereal and scraped together rent while he posted vacation photos from a beach she'd never seen. You clapped, she repeated, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. You think that makes up for 4 years of empty promises? You told me you'd help. You told Mom you'd help. And you didn't. He crossed his arms, rolling his eyes like she was the unreasonable one. I gave you what I could. You think money grows on trees? Your education was your responsibility too. You're an adult now, act like it. Something in her snapped then, not with rage, but with the cold calm she'd learned from watching her mother patch holes in the roof when he didn't show up. You're right, she said, her voice almost gentle. I am an adult. And I know exactly how much you didn't pay. Every single cent. He scoffed. The mistress tugged at his sleeve, trying to pull him back toward the car, her eyes darting around like she was embarrassed now that people were watching. Good, she thought. Let them see. Let them hear every ugly word. Don't make a scene, he muttered, leaning in close, his breath smelling faintly of the cheap wine the college served the parents. You got your degree, didn't you? Be grateful and move on. She didn't flinch. She held his stare, the roar in her head gone quiet now. I will, she said softly. And you're going to help. Just like you promised. She didn't wait for him to scoff again. She turned her back, the diploma folder pressed tight to her chest like a shield. She could feel his eyes on her all the way to her mother's car, but for once, she didn't care. He'd shown up for her day? Good. He was about to show up for the bill, too. She didn't say a word in the car on the way home. Her mother kept glancing sideways, trying to read her face in the reflection of the window. The sun was setting behind the rows of cheap apartment buildings they'd driven past 1,000 times, the warm orange glow blurring into the gray concrete that had made up so much of their lives. When they pulled up outside the tiny apartment she still technically shared with her mom until the new job paid enough to cover her own place, she sat there with her hand on the door handle for a full minute. Her mother cleared her throat, her voice soft and rough at the same time. I didn't know he'd bring her. I'm so sorry, baby. She shook her head, forcing a tight smile. It's not your fault. It never was. She meant that. Her mother had carried the weight of his broken promises longer than anyone, patching the holes in the roof, scraping together rent when the mortgage check didn't show up, nodding along when he said next month will be better. Inside, she went straight to her old bedroom, the one she'd turned into a makeshift storage space after she moved to campus for those last 2 years. The bed was stacked with boxes labeled tuition, loans, old tax stuff. It was all there, every letter from the bursar's office, every reminder that the next semester's bill was due, every crumpled note she'd made to herself on the back of receipts. Call Dad again. He promised half this term. She sat cross-legged on the faded quilt her grandmother had sewn for her high school graduation, the only graduation that hadn't ended in a fresh betrayal. One by one, she pulled out the old folders, the manila envelopes full of invoices stamped past due. She could see her own handwriting on the margins, her pen digging into the paper so hard it almost tore through. Dad said he'd pay this by Friday. He hadn't. She found the statement for the year she'd almost dropped out. The semester when her part-time job couldn't cover the rent, much less tuition. When she'd called him sobbing in the hallway outside her dorm room, begging him to wire her the money he'd promised. She remembered the silence on the other end, the way he'd sighed like her need was such an inconvenience, the promise he'd made just to get her off the phone. I'll take care of it, sweetheart. I've got it. Focus on school. She'd focused. She'd studied. She'd starved through some months. And he'd taken his mistress on a business retreat to Miami instead. The more she read, the more the hurt turned into something colder, sharper, almost comforting. This wasn't about guilt anymore. This was about numbers. Money he'd promised and money she'd scraped together with loans she'd be paying off for the next 10 years if she let him off the hook again. She flipped open her laptop and started to type. She listed every semester, every dollar he'd pledged but never paid, every late fee and interest charge she'd covered alone. By the time she was done, the sun was gone and the apartment was dark except for the bluish glow of the screen. Her mother knocked on the door frame, a steaming mug of chamomile tea in her hand. She looked at the stacks of paper spread across the bed, her lips pressed into a thin line. You're really going to do it? She nodded, feeling the knot in her chest loosen just enough to let her breathe. I should have done it years ago. He's the one who wanted to show up and play Father of the Year. Good, he can show up for the part that actually costs something. Her mother didn't argue. She set the tea down on the nightstand and kissed the top of her head, just like she used to when she was 8 years old and afraid of the dark. Just be ready. He'll try to turn it on you. He always does. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Let him try. This time, I have the receipts. When she turned back to the screen, she felt stronger than she'd felt in years. She wasn't the kid waiting by the door anymore, praying he'd show up. She was the adult, the graduate, the woman he'd underestimated for far too long. And she was about to remind him, and his little side piece, that every debt comes due eventually. She woke up the next morning to the smell of her mother's coffee brewing in the tiny kitchen. The place was so small she could hear the drip, drip, drip of the old machine from her bed. For years, that sound had comforted her, a reminder that her mom always found a way to keep things warm, even when the rest of the world went cold. This morning, though, the coffee felt more like armor. She wrapped her hands around the chipped mug, letting the steam clear the last traces of sleep from her head. Her laptop sat open on the table next to her. The spreadsheet she built last night was still there, every semester lined up like dominoes, every promise her father had made and broken now staring back at her in neat black and white rows. She took one last look at the total. It made her stomach flip, seeing the real number, the full price of all those nights she'd gone to bed hungry while he poured top-shelf champagne into someone else's glass. But this time, she didn't look away. After breakfast, she made a quick call to a friend from her ethics seminar, a guy who'd dropped out of law school but still helped people draft small claims letters when they didn't know where to start. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm and a little sleepy. Haven't heard from you in a while. You celebrating the big day? She snorted softly, pushing her hair back from her face. Yeah, you could say that. I need your help. I'm sending my dad the bill for every cent of tuition he said he'd cover. And I want it to be airtight. No loopholes, no whining about misunderstandings. He didn't laugh at her like she half expected. Instead, she could almost hear the grin in his voice. About time you played his game with his rules. Draft it up, send it over. I'll clean up the language. Make it so pretty he'll think a judge typed it himself. She spent the rest of the day pulling it all together. She found the old text messages, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll transfer you the money next week." The scribbled notes she'd made on her calendar, Dad promised $2,000 by Friday. The bank statements that never showed his name but always showed her overdraft fees. She attached screenshots of her loan balances and the late fees she'd had to cover with credit cards that still hung over her like storm clouds. She could feel the ghosts of all those nights pressing against her shoulders, the part-time job after her full course load, the professors who'd warned her to focus more when they had no idea she was covering rent and groceries while her classmates went home to family checks that cleared every semester. By the time her friend emailed her back, she had a full folder ready. He'd rewritten her draft into a neat, professional letter, not threatening, not emotional, just a clear, polite reminder that he'd made promises. She read the last line over and over. If this matter cannot be resolved privately, I am prepared to pursue reimbursement through small claims court. Her mother stood behind her shoulder, reading in silence. When she finished, she just nodded. Good. Maybe now he'll understand that showing up for a photo isn't the same as showing up when it counts. She printed out 2 copies. One for him and one for the mistress. After all, if she wanted to play family so badly she'd stand by him at graduation like she'd earned it, then she could stand by him for this, too. She slid the papers into crisp envelopes, sealed them, and pressed her thumb against the flap until the glue stuck. It felt strangely satisfying, like pressing a stamp onto an old wound to keep it from bleeding again. She pictured her father's smug smile from the day before, the mistress's condescending pat on her shoulder like she was the child in the room. She'd felt powerless then. Not now. This wasn't about screaming. It wasn't about revenge fantasies or slammed doors. It was about reminding him that every lie has a price tag. And this time, the one picking up the tab wouldn't be her. She chose a Saturday morning to send the envelopes. Part of her thought about mailing them and letting the postman do the work, impersonal, cold. But another part of her, the part that had grown sharper and more practical over the past 4 years, knew she needed to see his face when he realized this time she wouldn't swallow the guilt. So she called him first. Kept it simple. Can you and her be home around 10? I have something I'd like to drop off. He hesitated, that same tone he always got when he knew he'd been caught out but hadn't figured out how to spin it yet. What is this about? Can't it wait? She pictured the way he'd leaned back in his chair at graduation, the mistress's hand on his leg like she was staking a claim, like the whole thing was some twisted family reunion. She smiled, but her voice stayed even. No, Dad. It can't. When she pulled into his driveway, she sat for a moment behind the wheel, fingers tapping against the steering wheel, the 2 envelopes resting on the passenger seat like loaded weapons. She didn't feel nervous. Just clear. Clean, almost. The house looked the same as it always had, the flower beds her mother had once fussed over now full of weeds, the paint peeling on the shutters. She wondered if the mistress had thought she'd stepped into some fairy tale when he first brought her here. Did she picture herself queen of this castle, the broken pieces of another family neatly swept under the rug? He opened the door before she could knock, leaning on the frame like he was trying to reclaim some fatherly high ground. She could see the mistress behind him, arms crossed, watching like this was some petty drama she could roll her eyes at later. So? What's so important? He asked, voice light, condescending, just the way he used to talk when he needed to remind her she'd always be the child in this dynamic. She held out the 2 envelopes, one in each hand. He frowned, taking his, then glancing at the other. Why 2? She didn't flinch. Asterisk 1 for you. 1 for her. You wanted her to be family. Congratulations, she gets the bills, too. His face reddened, but he tore open the flap anyway. She watched the mistress lean over his shoulder, her perfectly lined lips tightening as they skimmed the neat rows of numbers, the polite but firm letterhead from her friend's paralegal side hustle. This is insane, he sputtered, shaking the pages like they might change if he rattled them enough. Asterisk, you can't just come here and demand money like I'm some stranger who owes you rent. She tilted her head, calm. Asterisk, you're not a stranger. You're my father, and you promised me you'd help. You didn't. So here's the balance. Pay it, or we go to court. The mistress stepped forward then, her voice syrupy with disbelief. Asterisk, honey, you can't really mean this. We're family. She cut her off with a cold, almost kind smile. Asterisk, no. Family doesn't stand in the way of each other's futures. Family doesn't sit next to my mother's husband at my graduation and pretend they belong. You're not family. You're an accessory to a debt. The words landed like a slap. Her dad's face twisted into something bitter and small. Asterisk, you're ungrateful. I paid what I could. Do you know what you're putting us through? She leaned in, her voice just above a whisper. Asterisk, do you know what you put me through? Those nights you promised a check and then ghosted me? The nights I went to bed hungry while you were in Miami with her? He tried to bluster, but she could see it in his eyes, the shift. The moment when the threat of public shame outweighed his cheap excuses. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to throw the past in his face again. The paper did that for her. She stepped back onto the porch, breathing in the warm breeze like it was the first taste of freedom she'd had in years. I'll expect the first payment by the end of the month, she said evenly. Asterisk, or you'll hear from a judge instead. She didn't wait for his sputtered curses, didn't wait for the mistress's indignant gasp. She turned, walked down the steps, and closed the gate behind her. He'd shown up for her graduation with the one person guaranteed to ruin it. Fine. She'd show up on his doorstep with every single cent he'd ever promised her. And this time, he'd pay. She didn't tell her mother every detail, though she knew she didn't have to. Her mom had seen it all before, the empty promises, the way he'd slip out of hard truths with a joke and a squeeze of her shoulder, the same way he'd tried to do to their daughter on that graduation lawn. But this time, it was different. This time, she didn't shrink away from the silence he left behind. The first payment landed in her account 3 weeks later. It came without so much as a text. No apology. No phone call. Just a bank notification that made her heart pound so hard she had to sit down at her tiny thrifted dining table. She stared at the numbers for a long time, half expecting the screen to glitch, or for him to find some last-minute excuse to back out. But the money stayed. A small chunk of the debt chipped away, and proof that he knew she wasn't bluffing this time. She opened her window, letting the warm breeze drift through the thin curtains. Her degree, freshly framed, leaned against the wall beside a stack of job applications and her rent statement. For the first time, the two felt like they belonged together, the promise and the proof. Not because he had given it to her, but because he'd finally been forced to pay what he owed. When her mom came home that night, she found her standing in the kitchen, staring at her phone, hands trembling but her face calm. Her mother didn't ask what it was. She just pulled her into a hug that smelled like the same budget fabric softener they'd used when she was a kid, when nights like this seemed impossible. Proud of you, she whispered against her hair. Asterisk, proud of you for not letting him write the ending. She nodded, blinking hard. Asterisk, me too. After that, she stopped watching the account every day. The money trickled in piece by piece, but she refused to let it live in her head the way he always had. She went to her new job interviews, took the cheapest bus to her first day at a downtown firm that didn't care where she'd come from or who she'd begged for help. Every time the bill chipped lower, she felt the weight ease from her shoulders, like bricks lifted one by one. He tried to call once, some half-drunken voicemail where he ranted about how no real daughter would treat her father like this. She played it once, sitting at her new desk with the hum of the city outside her window, then deleted it before she could let it settle in her bones. She owed him nothing more than exactly what she'd given, the same polite coldness she'd received every time he ghosted when tuition was due. By the time she made the final payment plan official with her lawyer friend, she felt different. Not angrier, not even vindictive. Just steady. Like she'd built her own foundation under her feet, brick by brick, truth by truth. She didn't need an apology or some dramatic scene. She didn't even need him to change. She just needed him to pay what he owed. And now he did. On a warm evening in late summer, she sat on the stoop of her tiny new apartment, sipping tea from a chipped mug she'd brought from her old college dorm. The streetlights flickered on one by one, shadows of kids playing tag on the sidewalk, their laughter echoing down the block. Her mother was inside, putting up new curtains with an old radio humming in the background. She knew, deep in her chest, that they'd both survived things no bank statement could capture. She reached for her phone, not to check her balance, but to switch it off completely. For once, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like freedom. He could keep his excuses. He could keep the mistress, too. She had her future, one she'd built without him, and the debt he once made her carry alone was now his burden to pay. She didn't hate him. She didn't need to. She'd turned the page on that chapter. And when she finally framed her degree and hung it in her new place, she smiled at it every time she passed by. Not because of what it cost her, but because it reminded her of how she'd learned to make them pay, one signature at a time.